Yes, welcome in. The Badger season done, most likely, following their... How would you describe that loss, Jesse? I feel like pathetic, embarrassing, horrible. I don't know. What descriptor would you like to use?
Those hoping we would start on a positive note are going to be in for a rude awakening. But if you've been following this team, you know that there isn't much positive to say based on what we've had to watch the last 5 games. I think those are all fair terms. Maybe it's relative. Hey, at least the defense didn't give up 40 plus, but this offense was absolutely putrid. And once again, an astounding lack of complementary football, but really just an astounding lack of quality football at any level. Minnesota won in all phases.
So, obviously, how that game played out wasn't great. I also don't think at this point people really give a crap how that game played out. Obviously, you want to win the Axe. It's a huge, huge game. I shouldn't say they don't care how it played out. They don't care to talk about how it played out. They want to talk about what's going on moving forward here. They lose to Minnesota. All right. That's 4 times in the last 7 years. It's not great. What is going to happen now? What's the next step? So what we've done throughout the season is say, what went right against whatever opponent and what went wrong against every opponent. We're not going to do that today. We're just not. We'll get to your questions, but most of your questions were about the future as well. So we can talk a little bit about it, and I'm sure we can throw anecdotes in here and there for how poor they played against Minnesota, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that game. Unless you have any interest in doing so, I don't.
No, look, the what went right segment would have been 5 seconds long, and I would have said at least the seniors got to have their moment in the sun, or should I say freezing cold, which was probably emblematic of everything that happened here on the coldest day in Camp Randall Stadium history for the Badgers in 60 years. They got to pose with their parents. Nothing about what happened during the game went right, and we all know, if you're listening and watching, what went wrong. The offense had its worst performance in a total offense standpoint since 2016, so I think what Luke Fickell had to address after the game is indicative of where we're at with this program. Maybe one of the questions was specifically pertaining to the Minnesota game, because it's not about the Minnesota loss. It's about what the Minnesota loss means in the grand scheme of things, and that's why I think you're right. It is important to talk about the future.
Yes, it is. I believe there was one question about Purdue or about Minnesota, right? You said, I think it was about not getting any work done on first down. And it led to him talking about that, but also then bigger picture stuff, because that's where it was. And in reading your story, which you can find up on The Athletic, I think you did a good job illustrating kind of where his mind was at during that press conference. So we'll get to that in just a second. Before we do, as always, Home Field is the official apparel sponsor of the camp. They have the best vintage gear you could possibly get. Someone was in my mentions yesterday. Do you feel bad having to do the home field read all the time now because of Wisconsin playing poorly? And I will flat out say no, because Wisconsin is not the only type of vintage gear that they have. They have a lot of vintage gear, and it's potentially, because we're going to talk about 1991, or, there's been a lot of references to 33 years ago, because this is their first 5-game losing streak since then. If you go back to my childhood, there were a lot of people in Wisconsin, growing up in Wisconsin, that would end up having a second team because Wisconsin was horrible. And so, a lot of people had different teams. Like, 2 of my favorite teams growing up, North Carolina and Washington. I had this Washington starter jacket. It was amazing. Either way, what I'm saying is they have a lot more vintage gear. And potentially, if you're looking for another team to root for here during bowl season, they've got the gear for you. And they have this Black Friday sale that's 30% off everything. I believe it ends pretty quickly here, but go check it out, homefieldapparel.com. All right. So as I said, no what went right, no what went wrong. It is holy crap, and not crap, but holy what now, right? So Luke Fickell and the Badgers finished 5-7. They're going to likely miss a bowl game. There are chances that a lot of things have to go their way. I think there's 9 or 10 games that would have to. I think there's 3 spots open. Maybe there's 2 spots open. It's irrelevant. They're not going to bowl game. And so 5-7 for the first time since 2001. Going going to miss a bowl game for the first time since 2001. And Luke Fickell was left with very few answers afterwards other than to be upset. And also, what was the other word he used?
I said it's anger and perplexion. I mean,
yes. All right, there you go. Perplexion.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what his press conference was. It was a little mixed, but we got some, knock it on the table, and we also got those that stay will be a champion, which I think is stolen from somebody else. So those are all the things that he had to say afterwards. But I'll let you go ahead and open this up and what you took away from Luke Fickell's press conference and what you concentrated your story on up on The Athletic this morning.
Well, what I took away are the same things I feel like we've been talking about for weeks on end, because when you're not winning, and Luke is not winning, he has a losing record at Wisconsin since the start of last season. I don't count that 2022 guaranteed rate bowl game as a win for him, even though the record technically does, because he didn't do anything. It was the previous staff. And so I look at, what have you done since you actually got here with your own staff? He's 12-13. He's 8-10 in the Big Ten. And when you were hired and paid as a top 20 coach, being under 500 was not the expectation or anywhere close to it. And that's why we're asking all of these big picture questions. And he may be getting tired of it, but I think he at least understands why he's being asked. It's the lack of answers. And I know I said last week, if he had the answers, something would be different in terms of on the field. But that to me was one of the kind of money quotes, if you will, when he was asked what his message to fans would be, because they are frustrated. And it was that those who stay will be a champion. But a lot of it keeps coming back to have faith in me. And he said they've got to believe, and obviously seeing is believing. Right now you're not seeing. And that's the problem, is there's nothing you can hang your hat on if you're Wisconsin's program and Luke Fickell to say, this is why you should have optimism, other than they've recruited at the high school level very well. And maybe in year 3 or year 4, something will be different. But he doesn't have, here's the difference between Paul Chryst and Luke Fickell. Cause I've gotten a lot of comments about maybe the being slow to react at the end of the Paul Chryst era of like, oh, well, he's got to go. He had sweat equity built up, success built up, multiple years worth. And that was what I fell back on is, okay, look, he's at least done this in the past to show it's possible. And with Luke, what he's done came at Cincinnati. And this is a completely different ball game in the Big Ten, and he doesn't have it here. So it's just much harder to have that so-called blind faith in whatever this process is. And that's kind of one of the big takeaways. Now, my story, I set it up with, I thought it was interesting. This game was played on November 29th, and he was introduced as the new head coach the night of November 28th, I think, 2022. So almost 2 years to the day. And of course, we remember that moment. It was like a celebratory moment, a victory lap for the program amid all this turmoil because, hey, we went and got this guy that's one of the hottest coaches in college football. And Chris McIntosh is talking about the goal is to compete for championships. Championship level expectations is how he termed it. Well, we're 2 years later, and they're not even close. And they keep getting embarrassed and losing all of these games where you legitimately, you can't point to almost any good win other than beating Minnesota a year ago. There aren't any good wins. And so the what now is like, if you want to be an optimist and be positive, it's maybe something will be different, but you don't have anything based in reality, at least on the field, to indicate why that's actually going to happen.
You have nothing to base it on. And his message is the same while addressing recruits, right? And addressing potential recruits and addressing his team. Like it's all this. I think that those that stay will be champions is a Bo Schembechler thing. So it's at least that's the first thing that popped up, but I believe there's others that have said it, but it's kind of funny, an Ohio State guy using a Michigan term to talk about it. But with his, the Paul Chryst thing, we always go back to it. I understand why people do. I get it. Because it's like Paul Chryst got fired after being embarrassed by Illinois. He had been 9-4 the previous year. And everyone's like, well, if Paul Chryst is being held to that same standard, why isn't Luke Fickell being held to that same standard? And I think obviously differences, and you've told this story a number of times, I don't think Chris McIntosh went into that meeting thinking that he was going to fire Paul Chryst. Correct? Right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
He didn't go in there with that intention. It was when discussing things that needed to change, and Paul was like, know or wasn't open to all the things that were being asked of him, that's when that happened. Luke Fickell has, I don't want to say revolutionized, but certainly made significant changes to this program and brought it into a spot where it can compete on a semi-national level for recruits, and has been active in the transfer portal. And Paul was too, prior, obviously, to it being able to move wherever he wanted to very, very quickly and play right away. But this, that's the reason why Paul got let go in that moment. But Luke Fickell has been embarrassed more times this year than maybe Paul was in his final 5 years. I mean, you just think about some of the games that they've lost and the way that they've lost them. It's just insane. Like the Indiana game last year, the Northwestern game last year, the Iowa game this year, the Alabama game this year, even though I know Alabama's what it is. Southern Cal blowing a halftime lead, losing the way you did to Nebraska. And then the capper obviously being Minnesota. It was horrendous and embarrassing. And 2022 was embarrassing as well. This has been 3 straight years of embarrassing football for Wisconsin fans, and not what they expected, certainly when Luke Fickell took over.
Yeah, it was interesting listening to the players afterward. And I think it's every single person that speaks publicly. And when we get players, they are hand selected generally by the media relations team, in large part because they are probably going to say something positive, though not always. They all say how much trust and support they have in Fickell. And at the same time, no one can say what's happened on the field is good enough. And Ben Barton was looking at the back where we do these interviews in the McLean Center, on the back wall of the McLean Center, all the bowl games. You had Rose Bowl after Rose Bowl, and they had that streak going of 22 straight bowl games. And he was looking at the back and saying, they're nowhere near whatever the standard used to be. And so it's just, there are so many more questions. I've said before, I think this is the most important offseason to date for Luke Fickell based on what has transpired, even though they're all important. But I think there's a faction of people that say he deserves time. And I don't disagree that he's going to get more time, and 2 years isn't enough. But there's also a faction that are just fed up with what they have to watch and the lack of answers. And I think it's really the last thing you want as a fan base is apathy. And I sort of feel like we're trending in that direction with these types of results, or if they continue. And so there's a lot on his plate that he has to figure out.
I think apathy comes when you lose to, and I could be wrong, but I think it's apathy when you lose to a team that you expect to lose to, and get embarrassed by a team you expect to get embarrassed by. So like in Alabama, you don't expect to get embarrassed by the 3 teams that you consider rivals. And they got embarrassed by all 3 of them this year. 2 of them hung 40 on them. Minnesota up 21-0 before Wisconsin had put the ball, I think before Wisconsin even had a chance to get in the red zone, Minnesota's red zone. It's that, to me, I don't think you'll ever, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if it just keeps happening, maybe it'll turn into what Minnesota was there for a long stretch when it couldn't beat Wisconsin. And there was some apathy and oh, whatever. But this for Wisconsin is, I think, still very, very maddening and very upsetting for fans to lose the way that they're losing to these teams. These were the teams that, and I know Luke Fickell said, this is no longer the Big Ten West. Well, it's a good thing, because you would have gone what in the Big Ten West this year? I mean, you lost to Minnesota, you lost to Iowa, you lost to Nebraska. You didn't get to play Illinois, but you beat Northwestern and you beat
Purdue.
Purdue, thank you. It's not like you would have ruled the Big Ten West there this year, guy. And what is he, in those games against those teams since he came too, right? He's lost to Iowa twice. He's split with Nebraska, split with Minnesota, split with Northwestern. It's not like he would be dominating the Big Ten West if they were still in it. It's not winning those games either.
Yeah, it's a really difficult spot, no question about it. And what he was trying to say is, and this was kind of Ben Barton relaying the message, or one of the messages that Fickell has had, is it's a new landscape in college football, and there's no hiding for Wisconsin, I think, is essentially what he meant, though. It's just,
but you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, of course. It's a bad look to suggest oh, well, this isn't the Big Ten West anymore, when you would be 2-3 in that Big Ten West this year. But
or
it just,
even more so. Sorry, even more so, as if like Wisconsin's success for so long was because it was in the Big Ten West.
right. It's just, it's harder than ever. And I mean, it's such a difficult spot in part because I don't really think that we can make comparisons to like, even 10, 20 years ago. We can in what we're seeing on the product in terms of it's nowhere close, but like those Wisconsin teams didn't have to play the teams that this Wisconsin team does. On the other hand, this is the landscape you entered into. Luke says all the time, we know what we signed up for. We tell the players this is what you signed up for. And, you look at the 2025 schedule. I think I felt very pessimistic at the end of last season. I can remember our last show after the Rely Quest Bowl and just thinking like, God, I don't know how this gets better. And I feel even worse now, in part because tell me how they get more wins next year. Tell me that schedule is absurd. They got to play at Alabama, at Oregon, at Indiana, at Michigan, at Minnesota, home games against Ohio State and Iowa. Now, Fickle hasn't played Michigan yet in his 2 years here, but he's played all those other teams, and his combined record against those opponents is 1-7. And so it just, people want to maybe say, okay, wait and see what happens in year 3, and we'll have all offseason to talk about it. But it's just hard for me to sit here and say that it's going to be better at all.
Well, I mean, I think the only way that it's better is if he hits a home run with his offensive coordinator hire.
Absolutely.
And a significant upgrade at quarterback. And to me, that's the only way it is. And because, Wisconsin's defense hasn't, like, getting run through like they did against Iowa and getting 40 put on them by like Nebraska did. And then yesterday, obviously, with what Minnesota did, the defense hasn't been nearly good enough. But I also think when you go on the field, knowing what you have on the other side and knowing what you're not going to get from your offense on a week-to-week basis, that has to hit. That, I mean, you can feed off of your offense, and the defense has had very little to feed off of over these last 2 years. That's not giving them any leeway, but I think a change here or there could significantly help them. Does that mean they're going to get more wins? Absolutely not, because that schedule is just an absolute bear. But they have played with a backup quarterback the last 2 years for large stretches of the season. I mean, I know nobody wants to blame that on that, but throw somebody else's backup quarterback, especially one as limited as Braden Locke, in there, and completely change what you want to be as an offense, because you can't run the ball with the quarterback anymore, and everyone's going to struggle. I'm not giving – look, Phil Longo didn't do a good enough job. He's the one that brought Braden Locke here. But I also look at this and say a serious upgrade at quarterback will make a lot of other things look better. And they need to find a way. They need to find a way to upgrade, whether it's a guy taking a jump that's on the roster right now, or when you bring the OC in, him bringing a guy with him, or, just something that jumps out. They need some life at quarterback. And your quote from Braden, if that happens, and he's somehow in a role as a player again next year, like at Wisconsin, that's just not it. It's not it. And you want to find apathy. You want to see apathy. You want to see a mix of apathy and pissed off. Throw that same thing out there that you did all year this year, and you will see it.
The holy crap, what now question leads to a series of other questions, and so many big ones that Luke has to answer. The quarterback one, who you're going to hire as offensive coordinator, whether Mike Tressel is the right answer, whether you've got enough talent, and how you even accumulate more talent, because they have not hit on the transfer portal. There's so much, but to the quarterback issue in particular, it's fascinating to me because there's nobody right now on the roster that's the answer. And I did ask Braden, do you expect to be here? Obviously, you came here because, in large part, Phil Longo was here. You had that relationship, all of that. Do you expect to be here when the team reconvenes in January? And his answer, and I'm paraphrasing, is that yes, he does. He has a lot of love for this place and for all those players, and he'd like to be a part of it moving forward. If I'm him, I can understand why you would roll the dice in that situation. He's already transferred once. I don't know if do you really want to start over somewhere else, or do you want to see where things stand in spring practice? Because let's be honest, with the current roster, Tyler Van Dyke, if he's still here, isn't going to be available to even participate in the spring. He's coming off the ACL injury. Maybe Matar wasn't able to pass Braden at this point. You're going to have Carter Smith coming in as a true freshman. Wisconsin's going to have to go to the transfer portal. I mean, it's becoming more and more obvious. And of course, we don't know at this point everyone who's going to be available, though very clearly this staff is probably doing a ton of research right now. The portal opens December 9th and it closes December 28th. And by then, I think the roster is going to look much, much different. And it has to start at quarterback, because you just can't have a guy out there that has been hovering around 50% completion rate in 7 of his 10 games this season, and it hasn't been good enough. I mean, look at the first half against Minnesota. He had 3 batted balls. The team had 3 first downs, no points, 43 yards of total offense. Like, I know they couldn't run the ball. And Luke said there's no way in hell you can run for 36 yards and beat a rival or Big Ten team, but you don't have good enough quarterback play. And so it has to start there and with the offensive coordinator.
It absolutely does. And you're right. It is going to look much different, but it's also going to look much different with guys leaving as well. And I thought it was, you ended your story talking about Vinny Anthony quote about just hopefully guys come back and we can keep as many guys as possible. That didn't sound overly optimistic. That felt like a guy who knows that there is a significant number of people out the door.
I followed up and asked him whether that was like how big of a concern that was for him. And he basically answered in the same way. He didn't say like, oh, it's a massive concern. I think a bunch of dudes are leaving, but I also think it just addresses the reality of where things stand, not only with college football, but with Wisconsin's program. I don't know if mass exodus is the right term. I mean, I thought that there would be a so-called mass exodus 2 years ago when Jim Leonard wasn't retained. And I think Luke did at least a decent job of convincing people to stick around. Now you can debate whether that was a good thing or a bad thing because they were part of a losing team before. But I do think there's going to be a lot of people that are disgruntled either with their role or with being a part of this and wanting to try their hand somewhere else. So absolutely, I think that there are going to be a number of players that leave. And when one of the guys that we talked to again, Ben Barton, I know, not necessarily an all Big Ten level defensive lineman, but someone who's played a lot of games and has another year of eligibility, wasn't honored on senior day. We asked him whether he would come back and he sort of waffled on it. He said like, I'm going to be playing college football next season, but it's still having those conversations ongoing. And I think that is going to be a legitimate consideration for a number of players.
So you think he wants to come back and they don't want him back?
No, I don't know if he knows whether he would necessarily
want to be back.
I mean, in the end, I think that he would be based on the other things that he said. But like,
he's a Wisconsin kid.
Yeah, he's just one of the few people that we've had a chance to talk to. And so I think that, there's going to be some roster turnover, and that's how it is every year, but it's going to be even more of a concern in a year like this, where you're got your first losing record as a program in 23 years.
I mean, I think the hope when you hear Vinny Anthony talk is that he's talking about hopefully guys stay. I think a lot of people would be hopeful that he stays.
Because I think he's going to stay.
But I mean, I'm just saying that because of what the breakout year that he had, I feel like there's going to be, especially because of how Wisconsin played and how things went, there's going to be people, little vultures, trying to pick off, little pieces here and there. And Vinny Anthony would be a piece that I think some people would would really want. I know he didn't make the play down the field yesterday that he wanted to, but he also had a touchdown, and he's been a bright spot for that offense that hasn't had a ton of them this year. So
I expect him to be here next year. I mean, he's very happy here, loves Madison, has a girlfriend, has a dog. You mentioned both of those things. So he is one that I would not be worrying about, but absolutely you can go down the list. And whenever we put together our next projected 2 deep, there's going to be a number of guys missing and a number of new additions.
It will be. And again, we know as we do this show sitting here on early Saturday morning, by the time I post it, we'll be getting those messages on Twitter. And because yes, the portal isn't open until the 9th, but we know guys, maybe they'll wait until after whether Wisconsin gets into a bowl game or not. I would assume that's not necessarily going to hold up their thing. I remember Minnesota when they got in last year, I think they had to bring a quarterback off, back from somewhere. Like he was getting married, and he was like a walk-on because Callie Kamanis left. I think they had some other guys leave. So it's just not an ideal situation to be in. And I don't think Wisconsin's going to be in it. We'll see. But this was a question that came up. And I know you mentioned it in your story, but it was a question that I got as part of our Twitter questions or X questions or Blue Sky questions. You can find both me and Jesse on Blue Sky if that's something you're interested in. If Luke Fickell did not have a $40 million buyout, would you fire him right now?
If I was Chris McIntosh or if I was a fan or what?
If I was Chris well, that's the problem because Chris McIntosh is kind of connected. So put on your athletic director hat. Jesse Temple is the Wisconsin athletic director. Would you fire him?
No, I wouldn't. But I think that's probably a frustrating answer to some because, again, I look at next year and think I don't see that it's going to be markedly better or potentially better at all. But there's two schools of thought here is if it's not working and you feel like it's, and I wrote this in the story, it has felt all along like they're trying to fit a round peg in a square hole. Like he tried to do some things that so-called modernized whatever this program was, but has gone away from some of the things that at least worked over time. I'm not going to sit here and say that Paul Chryst was the answer at the end. We know what happened there, but none of that has worked. And so if you feel like you are further away from where you want to be, do you just cut bait and start over? Well, the problem with that is you end up potentially in this consistent revolving door and you're going to lose all the recruits or a lot of them that if you really want to say something can be different, it's building a foundation on those players. I've said before, 19 four-star prospects in the last two classes. And so I think they're in a spot now where it's 4 years. But that puts a lot of pressure on 2026 and we haven't even gotten to 2025 yet. So I'm going to say no, that I wouldn't. But of course, the buyout changes that conversation entirely. He'd be due $40 million and Wisconsin got rid of its last head coach and paid him a reduced buyout of $11 million, which is an awful lot. And now you're talking about 4 times as much. So, yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I wouldn't at this point, but like, I don't know. It certainly feels like it's not working right now. And that's not even really a stretch.
I feel like obviously Jimbo Fisher had the biggest buyout of all time. I think it was like 70 some odd million. I feel like 40 million. If somehow they were to do it, which they're not going to, I think that'd be like the second biggest.
Yeah,
it'd be up there. What'd you say? Yeah, it would be up there. Going back to 2022, because we're mentioned 2022 before in the how everything played out with Paul Chryst and how this was, how is this season any different than what he did in 2022? And I look at that 2022 season and look at the teams they played and compare it to what they played this year, and it's not even close. I mean, they played one ranked team that year. Illinois wasn't. I don't think Illinois was ranked when they played Wisconsin because it was so early in the year. But they played one ranked team. It was Ohio State, and they lost by 31. They have played 3 top 5 teams. Those aren't the losses that the problem, though. It's the getting the crap beat out of you by Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota is the problem. And so I look at yesterday. I look at Minnesota's the Minnesota game yesterday, and this is another question that popped up. Did they give up yesterday? Did they give up Paul? Did they give up Illinois Paul Chryst 2022?
I don't really believe that they gave up it. I don't think they gave up this season, and maybe you could debate that based on some of the results. I just think they're not good. They are not they are not talented enough. They don't seem to have the right schemes, and frankly, they at least based on what we saw in the games, didn't seem to be a particularly well-coached team based on some of the coaching decisions. And to me, that's what it comes down to. Like, I do think that there's a lot of pride there. Now, Luke did say after the game, he said that they were, and he said mentally, physically, and emotionally drained, which players were willing to acknowledge, especially when you go through a 5-game losing streak like that. But I just don't think that they gave up. They're not good. They are not a good team. And that's kind of where I fall on that. Like, did they want to beat Minnesota? Yeah, but the offense couldn't move the ball for crap. I mean, the defense is in a spot where you give up 2 touchdowns. Let's be real. It was 14-0. And it's like, this game is over. That's a hard spot to be in, but I just don't think they quit.
Yeah, I said 7-0 was probably going to do it. I was wrong. That would have been a tie. That would have been a tie game instead. But I mean, look, as much as they played like absolute dog crap, it was 21-7, and they were inside the 10-yard line. Had an opportunity to make it a 1-score game early in the fourth quarter, and they end up fourth and like that's the kind of season it is. And look, they've been embarrassed by Minnesota before. I think 2018 was more embarrassing than that. I think the end of the 2021 game, or excuse me, the 2022 game was more embarrassing than that. The constant false
penalties.
starts. Like, yeah, I mean, that was just that was disgusting. But yesterday was right up there. Yesterday is right up there because Minnesota's came in and said, you can't move the ball against us. We got a good defense. You're not going to move the ball against us on the ground. And we know that guy ain't going to beat us. That's throwing the ball. So we're good. And Max Brosmer was pretty good yesterday. So obviously they got a lot better quarterback play out of their transfer than Wisconsin did. Now, again, Wisconsin's transfer was on the sideline. I don't know if he's still on crutches or not, but that's where Wisconsin's transfer was. But Minnesota, Max Brosmer was a good pickup for them for sure. Going to get into some more of these questions here. Nate says, what's holding the program back the most? Quarterback play, coaching staff, trench play, or consistency?
Every single one of them. That may sound like the cop-out answer.
The most.
God, that is so hard. Well, I'm going to start with quarterback play, just because we've seen how important it is for all these other programs. But there have been plenty of years where the quarterback play wasn't super high level, and yet they were able to consistently win because of the other things that they did well. It's hard for me to evaluate. What was one of those categories was in the trenches play, right? I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Like it's always so hard for me to evaluate who's winning the matchup with the offensive line, defensive line, but very clearly, like there was not enough impact on the defensive line, even though they were better than expectations. That's just because expectations were low. I mean, Darian Dupree certainly looks like a quality pickup for the future, but what we saw this year overall, I mean, was there the high-level running backs that we became accustomed to? No, I don't think so. They could make, when you were wrong, they could make you right. Now, maybe you think Darian is that guy, and he might be. But like Tui Walker, I mean, he had a solid season, but ran for less than 1,000 yards and just nowhere on the level of some of those other guys. So
he was virtually non-existent down like these last 3 games.
Yeah. So
the last 2 games.
There's just so much that goes into this. I mean, the whole identity thing comes up often, but I just think that like when you're losing and we're searching for answers, that's going to consistently come up. The things that they did well for so long, they don't do well, and they've gotten away from that. And hindsight is always 20/20, but you wonder what this would look like if under different circumstances with it. I mean, would it be better if they had a different staff? That's a hypothetical for another show, but none of those things are good enough. And so it's hard for me to say what the pie looks like.
Well, I want to say, could they be worse? But
I don't think so. Honestly,
I literally just talked about the end of the Minnesota game in 2022.
Yeah.
And we can blame the players for that, but coaches weren't good either. And I mean, there were a number of times throughout that season after Jim took over that you're like, okay, I guess. Like I don't know that the 2022 team was this great coach team, and the 2021 team was so well, so disciplined and amazing. I mean, the 21 team had an amazing defense because they had a bunch of NFL guys all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
This one doesn't. This team doesn't. That's probably as big of a challenge or as big of a difference either. I'm not backing up and saying that this coaching staff did a good job this year. They didn't. I'm not saying that. But I think it's also tough to see. Like, we all have a view of like what 2022 was, as if it was just the Illinois game just happened, and it's not a big deal, as if they hadn't lost by 31 the week before, and everything was fine, and they Chris McIntosh made a snap judgment in that moment. I don't know what it would again. I don't know what it would look like if Jim Leonhard was here and you had the offense that Sean Lewis would have brought in, and just keeping everything the same, but maybe doing a few upgrades recruiting wise. I don't know what the recruiting department looks like. I think the guys that they've brought in here have done a fantastic job recruiting. I don't know, you could ask for any more from them, but there's just so many what ifs to a decision that was 2 years ago that has looked horrible on the field and quite honestly pretty good off the field.
Maybe Wisconsin was always headed in this direction based on where college football was going. I mean, again, we're spouting hypotheticals here, and maybe not worth our time in this show, but
we got plenty of time for it.
We certainly
not
do.
Today. Yeah, not just today, but the rest of the
all
rest of the season.
Four of those things are well within the conversation here. It's hard for me to pick one above the others.
All right. We don't have all negatives here. Nate, he was the one that just asked this question, but he gets a second question here. What gets you excited for next year? I can go first. You already mentioned it. I think Darren Dupree has a shot to be a really, really, really good tailback for Wisconsin, assuming he's here. I think that and I'm going to say that for absolutely every player I talk about this offseason until the transfer portal closes. If he's here, I just have to throw that qualifier on all the time. But I think he looked explosive, especially in the last few games. He got one of his runs taken down from 13 down to 7 or something like that. His first carry yesterday. I thought he showed explosiveness, and I think once he becomes the guy, and I think he will be the guy, along with maybe some Dylan Jones thrown in there as well. I think I like that 1-2 punch at running back. It's just a matter of opening up holes for him. That might be the problem.
I suppose my answer would be this offensive coordinator hire, because it's so important. And it's not like, again, Luke said this, they're not going to start running 22 personnel and go back to what it once was. But if you make enough tweaks that take some of the things Wisconsin did well in this so-called modernized offense, however you want to frame it, and then also go back to things that traditionally have worked at Wisconsin, I want to know what that looks like. I think spring ball, and once again, will be very interesting. Again, what does the quarterback situation look like? It's hard for me to answer this right now without knowing what the roster looks like. But so do you hit on a quarterback? Because that can change everything. But really, offensive coordinator, what does this system look like? How different is it? And will it move the program forward? I think that's probably my number one as we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the points per game these last 2 years, they are the back-to-back lowest years since 1990 and 91 in terms of points per game. Not the low. I mean, again, 2004 is still sitting there at 20 points a game. But if you put the 2 years together, it's the worst back, in back-to-back years since Barry Alvarez's first and second years. And I believe he fired his offensive coordinator after the first, or was it the first year or the second year?
I thought
Russ
it was the
Jocks.
second year.
I thought it was the second year, and he brought in Brad Childress.
Yeah. That worked out well.
It did, and he brought a quarterback with him. If we remember correctly, he had coached Darrell Bevel before Darrell Bevel went on his mission, and brought Darrell Bevel with him, and things happened after that. What does Fickle actually contribute / do on game day? He's clearly a hell of a recruiter, but he doesn't call offensive or defensive plays, never seems to have a great understanding of in-game situations and strategy. Hard to see what he contributes. A question from Paul.
Well, I'm not on the sideline there. I mean, I think most times the head coach come game day is doing a lot of the things that Fickle would be doing. I mean, you have your offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator and your position coaches. So when those guys aren't on the field, they're meeting with their position coaches or the coordinators. So when you're the head coach at that point, you're not calling the plays. I mean, maybe there are going to be some situations where you perhaps are listening and override what it is. But generally speaking, come game day, I kind of feel like you're a large part cheerleader. You've got to be able to manage the clock and make some of those decisions and decide whether you're going to go for it on fourth down or whatever. But play to play, I don't know that the head coach does a whole lot, but I think you could say that for a lot of other guys, unless I'm wrong, Zach.
No, I think that there are absolutely a number of head coaches, or I should say a lot of head coaches, that have a bigger role in the play calling. We knew that with Paul Christ, right? He was obviously the offensive play caller, and that we see that quite a bit, especially when it comes to offensive guys. I think we see it more in the NFL than we do maybe at the college level. But like Matt LaFleur obviously is the head coach, but he also is the one calling the plays, and because that's why it never made sense to me for like Paul Chris not to call plays. Like that was the thing that that's why he got a job as a head coach, was because of what he did as an offensive coordinator and calling plays. So when he gave that away to Joe Rudolph, or however that whole ridiculous situation played out in 22 or 21? I think it was 21. Like, it just never made sense to me. That's what you do for a job. That's what you do well. Keep doing it. Fickle, as a defensive play caller, I think he has a much bigger role in the day-to-day on defense than he does offensively, but he definitely was sitting in on those meetings this year. And we know the impact that he had on the offensive game plan, or I shouldn't say the game plan, but the offensive identity this year, and wanting to be more physical and wanting to run the ball a certain way. We know that was put in. It felt like it was put in this past offseason, and it didn't help. But they also played some pretty good teams as well in that stretch. Over under, how many more years is Mike Tressel, the defensive coordinator for Wisconsin? He's going to Travis is starting at half a year, 0.5, starting next football season. Does he make? Essentially, he's saying, does he make it through next year as the defensive coordinator? Because he's not getting fired, right?
I don't think so. I don't think Luke wants to deal with 2 coordinator searches at this moment. But man, you got to be asking yourself some serious questions at this point about whether that's the path moving forward, because they just not even close to good enough. Now, total defense probably going to end up in the top 40 or so. But like that's not the standard for Wisconsin. I don't know. I think he'll still be here. Now, at the end of next season, maybe we can have another conversation. But I don't know. Mid-season firings, I don't know that's going to be the consistent theme here under Fickle.
Probably not. Tim asks, who would be considered the Badgers players of the year on offense, defense, and special teams?
Atticus Bertram's for special teams. Probably could have said that by week 2. He also got a lot of work, which says more about the offensive ineptitude. I think Vinny Anthony, offensively, certainly made tremendous progress and became their go-to threat. Defensively is probably harder for me. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I mean, what do you got?
I don't like it. I like the other 2 choices. Like Vinny Anthony would be my choice on offense, and certainly Atticus Bertram's on special teams. Defense, when I was asking this question, or I was about to ask this question, I was thinking through it, and I don't, like Hunter Wohler didn't have a great season by any stretch. He probably is their best defensive player, but I don't know that he made a ton of plays that just stand out and be like, oh, was amazing. So, I mean, Jake Chaney didn't have like the season that he wanted. There were just so many guys that did not have the seasons that maybe we were expecting coming into the year. Daryl Peterson was essentially non-existent. The outside linebackers were essentially non-existent for much of the year. That's a very tough question. The 2 transfer portal additions at inside linebacker, Jaheim Thomas, I think, was probably a letdown. And Taka Curtis never fully got going for whatever reason. So that's tough, man. I don't know that I can look and point to a guy who had a great season for them. Maybe Nizier Forkering.
Yeah, that's fair. That pretty much sums up the issues defensively.
They have a bunch of guys. They don't have a bunch of dudes. They have a bunch of guys. Is that fair?
From a productivity standpoint, nobody really stood out. So, yeah.
Michael asks, how does Fickle not institute wholesale changes after getting destroyed by each one of the rivals? Empty trophy case and no bowl for the first time in 20 years. Actually, the last time that they did not have a trophy in their locker room, 2 of those trophies didn't even exist.
That's right. The year before the Heartland Trophy.
2003. They lost at Minnesota. I believe that was Reese Lloyd jumping over the Badger bench to grab the axe. which they would do. They would not touch again after Wisconsin took it back in 2004. Wouldn't touch it again until 2018. So, yeah, but yeah, the Heartland Trophy was instituted the following year, or brought, made, instituted. What's the term?
Sure. I don't know.
Whatever. Irrelevant. And then 2014 with the Freedom Trophy. So yeah, they didn't even, the two of the trophies didn't even exist the last time this thing was empty. But if he doesn't do wholesale changes to the program, is he the problem?
Fair question. I guess I'd ask wholesale changes. I mean, you already fired your offensive coordinator midseason and you're going to replace him. So to me, wholesale would mean firing your defensive coordinator, because otherwise, I don't exactly know what we're talking about. He said before, it's not NFL free agency or whatever. You can't just say, hey, there's 80 guys. You're all gone. I'm going to go get 80 other guys. So I don't think that there are. Well, yes, that is one method. I think at this point that would be tough to do on with December approaching and the portal opening in 10 days. But so I don't think we're going to see so-called wholesale changes, like an overhaul of the staff. That's how I interpret it. But they're bringing in 20 plus recruits, and they're probably going to have 15 plus portal guys. The problem is, how many of those portal guys have they legitimately hit on? You just have to hit on more. So I think, it's banking on the offensive coordinator and quarterback situation, the way I see it.
I mean, they've absolutely hit on guys that have contributed, right? Like Jake Renfro and Joe Heber have both been contributors, and Tyree Walker was the leading rusher this year, and Nazir Forkreen has been a very nice addition. Elijah Hills was probably their most impactful defensive lineman this year. So it's not like they haven't hit home runs, right? They haven't hit in like all conference guys. We haven't seen that. So yeah, I would agree with that. Jordan says, who actually stays as part of the staff? Obviously going to be new OC. Do you expect more changes with the coaching staff, the 9 or 10 on-field assistants?
Tough one to answer. There are 4 guys that were they just got here, right? Like Kenny Guyton, by all accounts, very good hire, very positive, upbeat. Players love him. You could say the same for AJ Blazek. So there's 2 right there. They just hired a defensive line coach. They just brought in a safeties coach in Alex Grinch because Colin Hitchler left. So how many guys are we legitimately talking about here that are left? I don't anticipate a whole bunch of coaching changes other than the offensive coordinator. The thing that I think we don't know is, are those guys interested in other opportunities? And I'm not specifically talking about the 4 that just got here, but just the staff as a whole, because we saw a year ago people were leaving when other openings came about.
Yeah, look, there's always change. There's always going to be change. And so I would be shocked if it is just Phil Longo that is, in terms of the guys that started the year here that will end up being back with him. That feels unlikely, especially because, maybe the offensive coordinator wants different guys with him, or maybe, but this is the other thing, as Fickle has said, he hasn't worked with a ton of guys. So, that's weird. And that's, he's got former players. Obviously, Guyton is a former player, and I should say one of his former players. So I think the one guy that you absolutely definitely want to hold on to in terms of the offensive staff is AJ Blazek. I think he did a solid job with this group. I think he's definitely a plus recruiter, and I think he's going to maybe have a chance with some of these younger guys to build them up. And the talent along the offensive line has never been a problem in terms of on paper talent. It's the development of that talent. And that's certainly where Wisconsin needs to take a step up if they're going to have a chance to compete next year. They need the guys that are coming back. They're already on this team, not transfer portal guys, but guys that are already on this team to take a jump. And it starts with that offensive line for sure. Are rivalry games just another game with all the transfer portal guys? Especially when the head coach doesn't seem to embrace the tradition or importance, which I don't know that I necessarily agree with, but I understand where they're coming from.
I'll be honest, Zach. I think I feel this way more and more. I felt this way even just being around the team here these last few weeks. Like the Minnesota game, Mike Tressel's talking about going to a guy like Hunter Wohler. how many Hunter Wohlers are going to be left? And I don't want to bemoan what college football has become because it employs both of us, and people who are listening and watching love the sport and their team. But I just don't think it's ever going to be what it once was in terms of the importance of a lot of these things. I listened to Braden Locke talk about how much this state embraces and how much this game matters, and him and the program. And I have no doubt that he has embraced all that stuff. He's a kid from Texas who didn't know anything about this rivalry until a year ago and didn't play in it. And so I think we're losing some of that, where you got the in-state guy who grew up watching this rivalry, understanding it, and then you're going to play in it for 4 years. But that's because of where college football is headed. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be some of those guys, but I think there are going to be fewer and fewer. You're just going to have more transfer portal guys who frankly didn't know anything about this team until the window opened and saw an opportunity and maybe a chance to make some money. And I'm not saying they all come just for a cash grab. Like, that's not what I'm saying, but it's just different in college football. And so, yes, I do think that something here has been lost a bit.
So it was interesting to hear the senior video, or the senior video that they put out, like seniors talking about their favorite memories, and the transfer portal guys, except for I think one maybe mentioned the Minnesota game last year, but like all the walk-ons that were from Wisconsin and the scholarship guys from Wisconsin, maybe outside of Hunter Wohler, were just like getting the axe back last year, getting the axe back last year, getting the axe back last year. So, and others like, hanging out with the dudes, hanging out with the fellas. That's what I'm going to miss. Or, my favorite memory or whatever it is. So I think that there is maybe a little bit of a disconnect there for sure. Last one here. Tony says, in your opinion, has the program hit rock bottom yet? Is this rock bottom?
No. I don't think so. I don't have a crystal ball here, right, to project the future, but there's a chance that it doesn't work out with Luke Fickell. And I'm not saying that he's going to be fired and it's imminent, but like, I can't say that this is the bottom if you go get someone and it doesn't work out. And I can't project what's going to happen in 2025. I feel like it's going to be something similar. And I think that's going to be equally, if not more, demoralizing, that you're into year 3 and it hasn't changed. So I would have said in 2022, this loss to Illinois, this is rock bottom. And yet we're having this conversation 2 years later about at least 5 losses that could have qualified as rock bottom moments. And so, much like when I was making predictions toward the end of the season, and I said, like, I'm not going to pick Wisconsin until they can show me. I'm not going to say that they've hit rock bottom and it only gets better from here until you show me that you can start to build something and not just say you're building something.
It's a show me game from now on for Wisconsin and Jesse Temple. And I actually totally agree with it as well. Got to show me. We'll see how it goes. Wisconsin, again, probably unlikely to make a bowl game. That will be determined here on Saturday as the 5 and 7, or I should say, as a bunch of 5 and 7 teams try to get to 6 wins. Or 5 and 6 teams try to get to 6 wins. We'll see if they do it. Either way, we'll be back because I'm sure there's going to be news, offensive coordinator news, transfer portal news, and everything else as we head into the potentially earliest offseason for Wisconsin in 23 years. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.